Hey y'all! Real quick before we get started, I want to tell you about today's sponsor. If you're into paranormal fiction, this audio drama may be right up your alley. The Deepman Files, a paranormal mystery podcast, follows head researcher JB and pyrokinetic powerhouse Ash as they set out on paranormal investigations, seeking out everything from spirits of scientists to bunny-shaped beings on a bridge. Each episode covers a case from parapsychologist Dr. Deepman's personal files as he reviews his team's work in an attempt to see where it all went wrong. The Deepman Files is a fully voiced audio drama out now on most major podcasting networks. Now, on to today's episode. Hey y'all! Occasionally, an event happens that's seemingly unexplainable. It's not quite paranormal, but so confusing and mystifying that it defies reasonable explanation. These instances are commonly called a glitch in the matrix, a small tear in the fabric of reality as we know it. I have a compilation of stories for you today featuring these inexplicable events. I'm Candace, and I'll be your guide. About 6 or 8 years ago, my friend Giovanni and I left my house to go get some late-night McDonald's. You know, just as young guys do about 2 a.m. after a night of partying. We got into his white Mustang, left the neighborhood, and began driving on one of the main roads towards McDonald's. It was about 2 miles away. As we cross an intersection just about half a mile away from McDonald's, we get slammed by another car and thrown, and we proceed to roll. All I remember from the impact is that the car was speeding very fast. The impact was brutal. Glass shards flew everywhere, and the sound of plastic and metal scraping the asphalt. We died upon impact. We were gone. It just all went black. I saw that the car was annihilated looking at it from above. The scene was distressing. Then, just as soon as the scene played out of our deaths, it abruptly ended, and we automatically went back and were both standing at the front door about to leave to go to McDonald's. I look over at Gio, and Gio is tearing up and shaking with his hand on the doorknob. I say, bro, what the hell was that? If we leave and go right now, we're going to die in a car crash. All he replied with was something along the lines of, I know. Gio was shaking terribly, and I felt sick to my stomach. We had both just lived out our deaths. We both stepped away from the door and walked back into my family room and sat on the couch. We didn't say a word to each other. We just stared off into the distance. I had lived my own death, and so did he. We both knew it, and we both had no idea how to explain it. The best way I can try to explain it is it felt like a dream, where it's one of those just as almost too real to be a dream. We assuredly left the house and almost made it to McDonald's. But we got hit at an intersection, then flashed back almost immediately to my house. As a preface to this, I can count about 8 or 9 times throughout my life that I really ought to have died, but by some stroke of luck didn't. 6 years ago, I decided I was going to ride a bicycle across the U.S., from eastern Kentucky to the California coast. I'd been wearing a flat cap while riding, and most days that's what I wore. After eating, I got back on the bike and I was about to pull out towards the road, and this is where it gets weird. I can't really describe it. It was somewhere between a feeling and a voice in my head, but something in my head just goes, "Put on the effing helmet." I looked up at the road and said out loud, "Well, maybe I should," and switched headgear. 2 minutes later, I was lying on the side of the road, bleeding with multiple bones sticking out. I got hit by a van at about 60 miles an hour. According to the report and the eyewitnesses, I landed on my face the first bounce. My helmet was shattered across the front, but no head trauma. Maybe the weirdest part was that I never questioned that voice or feeling. Most of the memories from that day are faded and fuzzy, but that part still stands out completely clear. I was a kid, and my mom and I were outside taking pictures of old cars to sell in the backwoods area of our yard. All of a sudden, my mom hears rustling in the bush. She looks at me and she tells me to run. I had flip-flops on, so I kicked them off and I booked it. Behind me, I didn't hear my mom, but I heard like a rusty clanking sound, like something jumped up on the cars. While running, I didn't see my mom. I got into the house completely panicked, and there my mom was, sitting at the table reading the paper. What the hell? I have gone forward and asked my mom about this again. It's been many years and I'm an adult now. When I asked her, she looked at me funny and said she didn't remember any of it at all, just the cars that were in the backyard that got sold. 10 years ago, I was returning home from a road trip with 2 friends. I received a phone call from my parents asking when we would be arriving, and I explained that we were about 25 minutes away. About a minute later, we came around a bend. It was a full moon, and we could see the reflection from a lake below us. And other than that, the road was completely empty. Suddenly, everything went completely dark in the car. No lights from the dash or gauges, no headlights on the road. The music also stopped, and it restarted at the beginning of the CD we were listening to. Suddenly, there's now a vehicle pulled over by the police about a quarter mile in front of us that had not been there a split second before. I assumed that I just dozed off for a second as it was really late. I still thought it was quite peculiar, though. After about a minute, the driver of the car turned the music all the way down and said, "Did that just happen to anyone else?" The other passenger in the back seat sat forward abruptly and exclaimed, "I thought I just fell asleep." We then realized that the clock in the car was reading an hour later than it had just a minute before. To keep ourselves from freaking out, we decided that the car had possibly had a momentary electrical failure and had reset the clock to an odd time, turned off the dash lights, headlights, and gauges, and restarted the CD player. But when we arrived home 25 minutes later, we were an hour late. I am missing an hour of my life, and to this day, I have no idea how it happened. I had a long, involved dream where I was a vendor in a fish market. I remember getting up early, dressing, doing a whole morning routine, going to get tea, heading out to the docks, buying fish, loading them in a cart and going to get ice. Then haggling for ice, buying some less fresh fish while I was at it, then going to a market to my stall, setting up and selling fish all day. It was so real. I talked to my friends, smoked nasty cigarettes, haggled customers, ate lunch, had tea, and just lived through the day. At the end of the day, I cleaned up, counted my cash, paid the stall rent, went home, cooked some of the fish that I hadn't sold, along with some veggies and rice that I'd traded for. I drank more tea, relaxed for a while, then drew a hot bath, soaked and smoked some more cigs, then went to bed. The next morning, I woke up refreshed, ready to go down to the docks to buy fresh catch. Except I was in my house, next to my wife. Truck parked outside and it was Saturday, no work. My wife and I were getting ready to go skiing and the car was already packed. The weird thing was, in the dream, I was single and a smoker. And the whole long dream had been in fluent Chinese. The effortless kind of fluency that only comes from a lifetime of speaking it. I had been Chinese. I'm a big, white, hairy dude, somewhat fluent in Spanish, and I know a little bit of Russian, but I've never It was just weird. I've never worked in a fish market. I wonder who I was. I wonder what that was. About 15 years ago, when I was in my early 20s, I went on a camping trip with my family. My dad and I thought it would be fun to do some horseback riding, so we followed some road signs that we'd seen leading to a stable. The signs led us off the highway and onto a one-lane road deep in the mountains of southern West Virginia. A couple miles up this road, my dad slams on the brakes in front of a small, white Baptist church. He said, a little shook up, "See that church? I've been to that church, but it wasn't here." He definitely caught my attention, but I decided to mess with him a bit. I mean, the church looked like at least 80% of the churches around here. Nondescript, white, steeple and a church bell. It was around Easter, so they had a giant wooden cross on the lawn with a purple sash draped across it. And it sat on a tiny hill with a small graveyard to the side leading down to the road. Still, it could have easily been mistaken for another church someplace else. "Oh, yeah?" I asked, laughing. "Where was it?" Clearly not in the mood for my crap, he yelled and threw his hands in the air. "On top of a mountain in eastern Kentucky! I stop in front of it to eat my lunch there 3 days a week. It's the church I know. Everything is the same, but it's not supposed to be here." My dad was a truck driver and repaired and delivered parts to dozens of coal mines across Appalachia. So he had the majority of his meals on the road. And I believe he said the church was on Pine Mountain in Kentucky, but I could be wrong. Also, my dad is a hard-nosed cynic and incredibly bright. He's not one to say things like that. In fact, that was the first and only time I'd ever heard him say anything like that. Anyway, he eventually calmed down. We drove up to the stables, which were boarding stables only, meaning we couldn't ride. The road dead ended at the stables, so the only way out was back down the same road we traveled. Only, on the way out, the church wasn't there. It was gone. Now, the way I remember it, we stayed straight on the one-lane road and never took any turns onto other roads. We came out by a gas station, exactly where we turned onto that road. I was sweating bullets by this point. Dad needed to get gas, so I walked in to pay, and I asked the guy behind the counter about the church up the road. I pointed, which was clearly visible at our vantage point. He said, "Honey, there's no church up that road." Okay. When I got back in the car, my dad was smiling a little and said, "See? I told you it wasn't there." I don't know what happened that day, but I've never told anyone but my oldest son, who is now 14. My dad will mention it from time to time, but only when no one else is around. A couple weeks ago, my friend's dad told me a pretty bizarre story that scarred me for life. About 15 years ago, my friend's parents, Steve and Julie, were woken up at 1 a.m. to a very loud thud that rattled the whole house. Worried that one of the kids had fallen out of the bunk bed, Steve went downstairs to check on them, but all 3 kids were sound asleep and safe in their beds. Julie told Steve to go check the house in case of intruders, so Steve checked the doors and windows before going outside to take a look. After about 10 minutes of investigating the noise, Steve came across nothing unusual and went back inside to go to bed. He found his wife absolutely worried sick, and she demanded to know where the hell he had gone and what happened. Confused and tired, Steve told her he found nothing and tried to calm her down, before Julie pointed out that it was now 4 a.m. and he'd been missing for 3 hours. Julie had even gone outside to check on him, and he was nowhere to be found and didn't respond to her calling his name. Unable to figure out what happened, they returned to bed and slept until Steve had to get up for work in a few hours. Steve owns a painting business, and a couple hours after working on a house, he noticed his eyes started to feel itchy. And then his eyes started to burn. Then after a couple hours, his eyes burned so badly he was holding his eyelids open so as not to blink, because it felt like his lids were sandpaper against his eyes. His employees rushed him to the hospital, and Steve was treated for second-degree flash burns on his eyes. He was told his burns were equivalent to staring at a welder's torch without eye protection for an extended period of time. His eyes were treated, and he was lucky to have his vision fully restored. He is one of the most stand-up guys I know, and the way he told the story gave me the creeps. Dead serious and no explanation for what happened. His wife was there too, and she was visibly upset when he was telling me that story. Last summer, my car was in the shop for a while, so I had to depend on rides from friends and such to get around. One morning, my housemate woke me up saying there was some guy at the door looking for me. I tossed on some clothes and went to see who it was. This man, I'd never seen him before in my life. It made me really nervous, too, because even though he seemed friendly, the fact that he knew my name and where I lived, well, I thought maybe it was a stalker customer from work or something worse. Turns out he insisted that I take $40 from him. According to him, I had loaned him that money the night before at a nearby gas station, and, as promised, he was paying me back. Only I had not been to a gas station. In fact, at the time he said we'd met, I'd actually been at work. He looked at me like I was nuts when I said all this and eventually just told me, okay, well, I don't know, but you gave me your address to mail you a check. But since you lived close by, I just decided to pay you in cash. In the end, I took the money. Why not? Free $40, yay! But I was sort of freaked out. Maybe this guy was a stalker and this was some kind of elaborate ruse to meet me, right? Then this happened. 3 days later, I had my car again after forever. I stopped at a nearby gas station, but paid inside because I wanted some bottled water, too. There was one guy in front of me in line, arguing with the cashier. Apparently, he wanted to put $30 of gas in his truck and buy a pack of cigarettes, but his credit card kept being declined. This stranger, who looked nothing like the other stranger from a few days earlier, was begging for a break. He'd leave his phone, his wallet, anything as collateral. He just needed the gas to go home real quick and get some cash, then he'd be right back to pay. But the cashier refused. Finally, I just said, "That's like $40, right? For the gas and cigarettes?" Yep. I ended up giving him the same two $20 bills the first stranger had given me a few days earlier. He kept saying, "Bless you, bless, what's your name? I'll pay you back. Where do you live? I swear I'll pay you back right away." I was so freaked out by the coincidence and strangeness of it that I decided to break the circle. I gave him a fake name and told him he could pay me back the next day at a store I don't work at. Was that rude of me? I don't know. All I know is that I felt like I had to break the loop, or else I might forevermore be meeting strangers who either needed $40 or had $40 to give me. I never saw either of those gentlemen again, by the way. This happened in early 2000 when I was working at a juvenile detention center in a small town as a corrections officer. I was working nights at the time and went to work at 9 p.m. This one night when I arrived for work, my supervisor looked confused and asked me what I was doing there. I said, "I work tonight." And he said, "But they said you called in a few hours ago saying that you were sick." I was a bit confused and explained it must have been someone else and they got the message wrong. After everyone else showed up for work that night, it was a bit more weird, but we carried on as usual and assigned everyone their places for the night. I went to work in the control room where I usually work. The control room is the center of the prison that has direct control over the cameras, doors, phones, and everything. After I relieved the guard on duty and settled in for the night, I looked at the message that said I'd called in. It said that I had called at 6:50 and said that I'd gotten sick while out cleaning up after the storm. There'd been a storm the night before and it was a bit bad, but not anything that I had to go out to clean up. It was truly weird. The supervisor came into the control room at about that time. He was also a friend of mine outside of work, and we started talking about it and how odd it was. I decided to call my wife at home and tell her about it while he was still sitting there. I picked up the phone and dialed. After 2 rings, a man picked up the phone and with a raspy voice said, "Hello?" I didn't know what to say for a few seconds. I looked at the phone to make sure I had dialed the right number, and I had. After a few seconds, the person said, "Hello?" again in the same raspy voice. I said, "Hello, who is this?" "This is Taylor. Who's this?" the person said. And my head started spinning because my name is Taylor also. I said in almost a scream, "Where is Anne?" He said, "Anne's in bed. Who's this?" I dropped the phone and told my supervisor to ring me out. I had to get home, and I took off towards the door. I could hear Dave pick up the phone behind me and say, "Hello?" followed soon after by "What the hell?" rather loudly. I ran to my car and drove home faster than what was legal, my mind racing the entire time. Busted through the door, and my wife was sitting there watching TV and was shocked at me being home. I asked her who was there, and she said, "No one has been here." After a rather long talk with my wife, I went to call the prison and tell them what was going on, but the phone was dead. I went back to work, and when I came in, Dave was acting weird and asked me, "How the hell are you doing this?" He told me that when I left, he picked up the phone, and the person on the other end sounded like me. He kind of freaked out and hung up the phone. A minute later, as he could see my car leaving the parking lot, I had called back from home and asked what the hell was going on. He said that I was a bit irate and said I was sick and didn't feel like playing these games, and was telling him to stop prank calling me, and hung up. After convincing him I had no idea what was going on, we went back to work. Later, I find out that the phone line for my area had been knocked down the night before by the storm. This is absolutely the strangest thing that has ever happened to me. Okay, y'all, that's it for today's Glitch in the Matrix stories. Now let's talk about them. Y'all, these stories are incredible to me, especially the ones where more than one person has the experience. Like the first story with the 2 guys who saw themselves die on their way to McDonald's and then were somehow teleported back to the guy's house. Do you think that was like a divine warning or divine intervention, or do you think it could have been some kind of alternate reality? Because that one could really go either way between those 2 options, but I cannot think of another option that it could be, honestly. The same way with the last story, the one with the Taylor and Anne and the alternate Taylor and Anne. It makes me wonder if the storm that they were talking about made something happen. Storms obviously have a great deal of energy, and that can influence supernatural events. Or, most likely, the phone lines got crossed, and by pure coincidence, another Taylor and Anne were the ones that had been reached. But even if that's the case, it's still absolutely bizarre the way everything played out. Now, admittedly, the ones where people end up missing time would be really easy to attribute to extraterrestrial activity, because it's really difficult to explain otherwise how 3 people in a car lost an hour of time where everything went black, but they didn't crash the car despite losing the headlights. Nothing else seemingly happened. They just lost an hour of time. And then Steve, who went outside to investigate the weird noise and went missing for 3 hours and had burns to his eyes. How else can you explain that? Like, I'm racking my mind for a reasonable explanation. And aside from him sleepwalking, and who knows what he could have been doing while sleepwalking, I can't come up with anything else. The story of the Chinese fishmonger, that I could see how people could relate that to like a past life experience, or maybe an alternate timeline, but, logically, it sounds just like a really vivid, detailed dream. I don't know how anyone else dreams, of course, but I know I've never had a dream that detailed before, but who knows? But stories like these just reinforce my belief that somehow there are different timelines that run parallel to our own, but are different. It's like somehow a small opening just like punctures between the two, just enough for a little peek. Honestly, I think that's what a lot of hauntings are, too. Just a tiny peek between those two worlds. Anyhow, as always, I want to know what you think. Which story was your favorite? Have you had anything similar to these happen to you? Because I would love to hear about that. You can find me on social media at obscureappalachia and also on the pod's website, obscureappalachia.com. You know the drill. Subscribe, review, all that good stuff. Thanks, y'all. Until next time.